May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the smouldering ruins of the Third Reich, millions of weapons fall silent. In abandoned bunkers beneath Berlin, in the forests of Bavaria, in hastily evacuated depots across Germany and Austria, they lie scattered like fallen leaves after a storm. Among them, a curious anomaly. Tens of thousands of British Sten submachine guns, that crude but effective weapon of Allied resistance, now deep inside enemy territory. These weren't captured trophies, they weren't battlefield pickups. They were deliberate shipments, secret deliveries, weapons of shadow warfare that had armed partisans, resistance fighters and special operations forces behind enemy lines. The British War Office had dropped them by parachute, smuggled them across borders, handed them to anyone willing to fight fascism. Over 80,000 of these distinctive weapons had disappeared into occupied Europe between 1942 and 1945, vanishing into the underground networks of a continent at war. Now the war was over. The resistance fighters were emerging from the forests and safe houses. The secret armies were dissolving. The clandestine networks were shutting down. And somewhere in the chaos of victory and collapse, 80,000 British submachine guns simply disappeared. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to these weapons after the guns fell silent? The Sten gun was never meant to be beautiful. Designed in 1941 during Britain's darkest hour, it was an emergency measure, a crude answer to a desperate question. How do you arm a nation when your factories are being bombed and your empire is under siege? The answer was the Sten. Cheap, simple, stamped from sheet metal, requiring minimal machining and virtually no skilled labor to produce. Between 1941 and 1945, British factories manufactured approximately 4 million Sten guns. The weapon cost just $10 to produce, compared to $200 for a Thompson submachine gun. It could be assembled in 5 hours. It was ugly, unreliable, and prone to accidental discharge. It was also exactly what the war required. But not all Stens were destined for British soldiers. Starting in 1942, the Special Operations Executive, Britain's secret warfare organisation, began a massive programme of clandestine arms deliveries. They needed weapons that could be mass-produced, easily concealed, and simple enough for untrained civilians to use. The Sten was perfect. Over the next 3 years, more than 80,000 Sten guns were parachuted into occupied France, Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, Norway, Denmark, and Poland. They armed the French Maquis, Tito's partisans, the Greek resistance, the Polish Home Army. Imagine crates splitting open in moonlit fields, resistance fighters gathering weapons by candlelight in farmhouse cellars, these crude metal tubes becoming symbols of defiance across a conquered continent. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, these weapons didn't simply vanish. They were out there, distributed across hundreds of resistance groups, hidden in thousands of secret caches, carried by tens of thousands of former partisans who had no intention of surrendering them. The British government faced an unprecedented problem. They had deliberately flooded occupied Europe with weapons, and now they had to live with the consequences. The immediate aftermath was chaos. In the first weeks after VE Day, Allied military government teams fanned out across liberated Europe with a single mandate: collect weapons, any weapons, all weapons. In France alone, American and British forces established hundreds of collection points where resistance fighters were ordered to turn in their arms. Long lines formed outside requisition schools and town halls. Former Maquis fighters, men and women who had risked everything fighting the Germans, now shuffled forward to surrender the weapons that had kept them alive. Most complied. Most, but not all. In the Vercors Plateau, where the resistance had suffered a devastating defeat in 1944, former fighters buried their Stens in the limestone caves that had sheltered them during the occupation. In the forests of Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans, now the army of a new communist state, had no intention of disarming. In Greece, where civil war was already brewing between communist and royalist resistance factions, the weapons simply changed hands, moving from one conflict directly into another. The British Stens that had fought fascism in 1944 were fighting communism by 1946. The collection centres filled with weapons, picture warehouse after warehouse, vast industrial spaces that had once manufactured tanks or aircraft, now packed floor to ceiling with surrendered arms. In these spaces, British and American ordnance teams began the grim work of categorization. Rifles in one section, pistols in another, submachine guns in a third. The Stens were instantly recognizable, that distinctive side-mounted magazine, the skeletal wire stock, the crude tube receiver. Teams worked in shifts, 12 hours a day, sorting through the metallic harvest of 6 years of war. But what do you do with 80,000 submachine guns you no longer need? The British military in 1945 faced a logistical nightmare. They had millions of their own Stens in inventory, modern versions, factory-fresh weapons still in Cosmoline. These resistance Stens were worn, damaged, often modified in crude field workshops. Many had been buried in the ground, exposed to moisture and corrosion. Some had been assembled from scavenged parts by resistance fighters who had never seen a factory. They were militarily worthless. The decision was made quickly and executed without sentiment. Destruction. Mass destruction on an industrial scale. At dozens of sites across Western Europe, the scrapping began. In northern France, near the port of Cherbourg, American engineers bulldozed thousands of weapons into enormous pits. The Stens went in alongside German Mausers, Italian Carcanos, captured Soviet PPSHs. Imagine the scene, mechanical shovels scooping tons of steel and wood, dumping them into excavations the size of houses. Then came the thermite. White-hot chemical fires that melted receivers, barrels, stocks into unrecognizable slag. In Britain itself, the Ministry of Supply established processing centres, where returning Stens were rendered permanently inoperable. The method was brutally efficient. Workers mounted the weapons in hydraulic presses and crushed the receivers into twisted metal fragments. The distinctive tube that gave the Sten its crude simplicity was compressed into unrecognizable scrap. Thousands per week went through these facilities. The metal was sorted by type and sold to scrap merchants. Steel that had been stamped in Birmingham in 1943, dropped into France in 1944, fired in anger against German soldiers, was melted down and repurposed. Some of it probably became cookware, construction materials, automobile parts. But destruction wasn't the only fate. Even as thousands of Stens were being crushed and melted, others were being carefully preserved and redistributed. The emerging Cold War created new demands, new conflicts, new clients desperate for weapons. The British government, along with its American allies, began a covert program of military assistance to anti-communist forces around the world. The weapons they had collected from European resistance fighters found new users in very different wars. Greece became the first destination. The Greek Civil War, which erupted in full fury in 1946, pitted communist partisans against government forces backed by Britain and America. Both sides had fought the Germans. Both sides had received British weapons during the occupation. Now they fought each other with the same Stens that had once united them against fascism. British military advisors in Athens requisitioned thousands of the collected weapons and shipped them to royalist forces. In the mountains of Epirus and Macedonia, former resistance fighters faced each other across battle lines, firing the same model submachine guns they had carried against the Wehrmacht. French Indochina was next. As France struggled to reassert control over Vietnam after 1945, the French military needed weapons, any weapons, to arm the local militias and colonial forces fighting Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh. The British, eager to support their French allies and containing communism in Asia, began transferring surplus Stens, Thousands were shipped to Saigon between 1946 and 1950. Picture them arriving in tropical heat. These weapons, designed in grey British workshops, now carried through rice paddies and jungle trails. French colonial troops, Vietnamese militiamen, even some Viet Minh forces who captured them in battle, all used British Stens in the First Indochina War. The transfers continued throughout the late 1940s. Palestine received Stens for British police and military forces trying to control the escalating Jewish-Arab violence before the mandate ended. Malaya received thousands for use against communist insurgents during the emergency that began in 1948. Kenya would later receive them for use against the Mau Mau rebellion in the 1950s. The pattern repeated across the dying British Empire. Conflict erupted, local forces needed weapons, surplus Stens were shipped from European stockpiles or British warehouses. Indonesia presents one of the strangest chapters in the Stens post-war odyssey. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Indonesian nationalists declared independence from Dutch colonial rule. The British Army, responsible for accepting the Japanese surrender in the Dutch East Indies, found itself caught between Indonesian Republicans and Dutch forces trying to reclaim their colony. British paratroopers in Java encountered Indonesian fighters armed with Japanese weapons, improvised arms, and, curiously, British Stens. These weapons had been dropped to anti-Japanese resistance groups in 1945, during the final months of the war. Now those same resistance fighters were using British weapons against British and Dutch forces. At the Battle of Surabaya in November 1945, British Indian Army troops took casualties from Sten fire, killed by weapons their own Special Operations Executive had delivered just months earlier. But perhaps the most ironic reuse came in the new state of Israel. In 1947 and 1948, as Jewish and Arab forces prepared for war over Palestine, both sides scrambled for weapons. The Haganah, the Jewish underground army, acquired thousands of surplus Stens through covert purchases in Europe. Czech arms dealers, operating with tacit Soviet approval in the early months of 1948, bought British Stens from collectors and surplus stocks across Europe and shipped them to Jewish forces. At the same time, Arab forces were receiving Stens from British military stockpiles that were supposed to be securing the mandate. In the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, former resistance Stens that had fought in France and Yugoslavia were now fighting in Jerusalem and the Negev. Yet not all the 80,000 disappeared into wars or scrap heaps. Some simply stayed where they were, forgotten in the chaos of peace. In the forests of the Ardennes, 2 hikers in 1967 discovered a cache of 17 Stens wrapped in oiled canvas, buried in a metal container beneath a stone marker. The weapons were still functional, still loaded, still waiting for partisans who would never return. Belgian authorities traced them to a resistance cell that had operated in the area in 1944. Of the 6 members who knew the location, 4 had died in the war. The remaining 2 had emigrated and apparently decided some secrets should stay buried. A French farmer ploughing his fields near Lyon in 1978 unearthed a container holding 9 Stens and 3,000 rounds of ammunition. The container bore British military markings and a parachute delivery date of August 1944. For 34 years, this small arsenal had lain 15 feet beneath the topsoil, unknown and untouched. The farmer reported it to authorities. The weapons were corroded but recognizable. They were destroyed, but not before military historians photographed and documented them, rare examples of Stens exactly as they had been when dropped into occupied France. The most remarkable discovery came in Norway in 1995. During renovation of an old farm building in the Telemark region, workers found a false wall. Behind it, carefully arranged on wooden racks, were 42 Stens, all wrapped in waxed paper, all accompanied by detailed maintenance logs in Norwegian. The logs revealed these weapons had been part of a Milorg resistance cache, hidden in 1944 and checked regularly until 1947. Then the entries stopped. The resistance member responsible for the cache had apparently died without telling anyone. For nearly 50 years, these weapons waited in perfect darkness, slowly deteriorating but still intact. These discoveries continued into the 21st century. In 2003, construction workers in Warsaw found a bricked-up basement containing weapons from the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, including a dozen British Stens. In 2011, a metal detector enthusiast in the French countryside near Dijon located a buried container with 5 Stens, still packed in their original British shipping crates. Each discovery told the same story: weapons hidden in haste, meant to be retrieved, then abandoned when their owners died, emigrated, or simply chose to leave the war behind. The weapons that weren't destroyed or redistributed often ended up in the strangest places. Museums acquired some for their collections, carefully restored examples that now sit in climate-controlled cases in London, Paris, Warsaw, and Washington. But others took more unusual paths. A British Sten dropped into Denmark in 1943 was sold as surplus in 1952, purchased by a Canadian collector, and eventually donated to a small local museum in Saskatchewan. Another, used by the French Marquis in the Dordogne, was kept by a resistance fighter who became a village mayor. After his death in 1989, his family discovered he had mounted it, deactivated but still intact, on a plaque in his attic with a handwritten note: "Liberation Weapon, September 1944. The film industry became an unlikely repository for authentic Stens. British and American production companies in the 1950s and 1960s, making countless World War II films, needed period weapons. They bought up deactivated Stens from military surplus dealers. That distinctive silhouette appeared in dozens of war movies, handled by actors playing commandos, resistance fighters, and British paratroopers. Some of these props were genuine resistance weapons, objects that had seen real combat now firing blank cartridges on movie sets. Private collectors absorbed thousands more. In Britain, where firearms regulations eventually became extremely strict, many Stens were deactivated and sold as historical artifacts. In the United States, which received hundreds of thousands of Stens through Lend-Lease and military aid programs, surplus weapons flooded the civilian market in the 1950s and 1960s. You could buy a demilitarized Sten through mail-order catalogs for $15. American gun collectors snapped them up. Today, authentic World War II-era Stens, properly registered, trade for thousands of dollars among serious collectors. But what of those that stayed in military service? The British Army itself continued using Stens well into the 1960s. They were issued to territorial units, kept in reserve stockpiles, used for training. During the Suez Crisis in 1956, British paratroopers jumping into Egypt carried Stens alongside more modern Sterling submachine guns. In Northern Ireland during the early Troubles, British soldiers on patrol occasionally carried Stens as personal defence weapons. The last official British military use came in the 1970s, when remaining stocks were finally withdrawn and replaced entirely by the Sterling. Other nations held onto their Stens even longer. The Portuguese army used them in their colonial wars in Africa throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese troops and pro-government militias carried Stens against independence movements. Some of these weapons had originally been supplied to Portuguese forces in the 1950s. Others were captured from liberation movements that had received them through complex chains of Cold War arms transfers. The strangest military career belonged to Stens that ended up in the Middle East. In Lebanon's civil war, which began in 1975 and raged for 15 years, various militias used weapons from every era and every conflict. Among them were British Stens, some dating to World War II deliveries, others acquired through black market arms deals that traced back to Cold War surplus. Journalists covering the war in the 1980s photographed Lebanese fighters carrying Stens alongside Kalashnikovs and M16. These weapons, designed in 1941 Britain, were still killing people in 1985 Beirut. The criminal underworld also absorbed countless stens. Their simplicity made them attractive to criminal organizations. In Britain during the 1950s and 1960s, police recovered stens from armed robberies and gang conflicts. The weapons were easy to conceal, simple to maintain, and still plentiful in surplus markets. The Kray twins, London's notorious gangsters, were known to have stens in their arsenal. In Australia, which had manufactured its own stens during the war, surplus weapons found their way into criminal hands. Melbourne police in the 1970s dealt with several shootings involving stens that had been stolen from military stockpiles decades earlier. Underwater, the sea claimed its share. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in 1945, thousands of weapons were dumped into rivers to prevent their capture or unauthorized use. The Thames, the Seine, the Danube all became repositories for surplus arms. Divers exploring these rivers have recovered stens, often heavily corroded but still recognizable. In 2008, a Rotterdam salvage company dredging the Maas River brought up a container holding 23 stens in various states of decay. They had been underwater for more than 60 years. The Pacific Ocean holds its own collection. After the war, massive quantities of surplus military equipment were simply dumped at sea rather than transported home. At designated deep water disposal sites off Japan, the Philippines, and the Marianas, American forces pushed tons of equipment off barges and ships. Among the jeeps, artillery pieces, and ammunition going to the bottom were countless small arms, including stens that had been supplied to Allied forces in Southeast Asia. They lie there still, in the abyssal darkness, slowly corroding into unrecognizable masses. But perhaps the most poignant fate belonged to those that returned to Britain and were issued to the very organizations that had distributed them. The Home Guard, Britain's civilian defence force, received thousands of surplus stens after the war for territorial defence. Some of these weapons had been dropped into France, used by resistance fighters, collected in 1945, shipped back to Britain, refurbished and reissued. Imagine a London clerk or Birmingham shopkeeper in 1950 training with a Sten on weekends, holding a weapon that had fought in the shadows of occupied Europe, never knowing its history. Today, the 80,000 stens that disappeared into occupied Europe have scattered to the ends of the earth. Some rust in museum basements, waiting for display space that will never come. Some hang on collectors' walls, deactivated and harmless. Some lie buried in forests and fields across Europe, still waiting to be discovered. Some sit in police evidence rooms, recovered from criminals who never knew they were handling pieces of history. Some have been melted down, their molecules dispersed into 1,000 different objects, their identity erased completely. The best estimates suggest that fewer than 5,000 of the original 80,000 can be accounted for today. Museums hold perhaps 500 in their collections worldwide. Private collectors in America and Europe own maybe 2,000 to 3,000, most deactivated or heavily restricted. Another 1,000 or so might still be in military inventory somewhere, forgotten in depots or waiting to be demilitarized. The rest, 75,000 weapons, have vanished completely into history's chaos. But occasionally one surfaces. In 2019, construction workers renovating a building in Prague found a wall cavity containing a single sten wrapped in oiled cloth. The weapon bore Czech resistance markings. It was traced to a drop mission in March 1945, 2 months before the war ended. For 74 years, it had waited in darkness. These discoveries continue because the war's shadow is long, longer than anyone expected. The generation that hid these weapons is nearly gone. The last French Maquis fighters are in their 90s and 100s. The last Yugoslav partisans are dying. Their secrets die with them. But the weapons remain, patient, indestructible in the right conditions, waiting for the next farmer's plough, the next construction crew, the next curious metal detector enthusiast. What really happened to those 80,000 British Sten guns after the war? They were destroyed and recycled. They fought in a dozen new wars across 3 continents. They armed both sides in conflicts their creators never anticipated. They killed in the name of causes they were never designed to serve. They were buried, abandoned, forgotten. They became museum pieces, movie props, criminal tools, collector's items. They were scattered across the world like seeds taking root in the strangest soil. But more than anything, they became ghosts. Ghosts of the resistance, of the secret war, of that desperate time when Britain armed anyone willing to fight fascism without thinking about what would happen when the fighting stopped. Every Sten that surfaces from a French field or a Norwegian farmhouse is a reminder that wars don't end cleanly, that the weapons we distribute in desperation have lives longer than the conflicts that spawned them. That metal and wood endure long after the hands that held them have turned to dust. The war ended in 1945, but for 80,000 British submachine guns scattered across a shattered continent, the journey was just beginning. Most of that journey is lost to us now, erased by rust and time, and the deliberate forgetting that comes with peace. But occasionally, when a metal detector beeps in a French forest, when workers break through a false wall, when a diver's light catches a distinctive silhouette on a riverbed, we remember. The guns are still out there, still waiting, still carrying their secrets into the future.